Hello and welcome to Writer Rant, author advice in 5 minutes or less because I have to get back to writing and so do you. So one of the things I've noticed recently in the books that I've been reading is that a lot of books by amateur authors, and actually authors who've done quite a lot of good work too, have a problem which I'd call too many subplots. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about, you've got a main story that kind of drives the entire arc of the book, but then you have all these kind of subplots, all these different characters who are running around doing their own thing that most of the time, yeah, they support kind of the main plot that you're going towards. A lot of times, especially with the newer authors, you're going to find a lot of these subplots don't really go anywhere. It's just like, okay, yeah, so you've got this character and they're doing their own thing, and I mean, it's a so what. The problem is that when you include too many characters who are going on too many subplots, it starts to become hard to keep them all separate. So as readers, you got to give the reader at least something that, like, oh yeah, no, I remember where we're at, I remember who this character is, what their motivations are, all those kind of things. And a lot of that can take time and plenty of words to get done. And so what you'll sometimes find is if your book is getting really big, so take for instance, I really like Brandon Sanderson, I really like his books, but I'm kind of struggling my way through his The Way of Kings book because there's essentially 4 parts, and each of these parts has about 2, maybe 3 different characters that you're following through this, and I'm just like, okay, one of these characters is really interesting, maybe some of the other characters aren't as interesting, or their arcs are just kind of like all over the place, and I'm just like, okay, I can follow this one character. If the book was all about this one character, man, I'd be in it. But I get there's kind of an ebb and flow that you have to have in your story, but sometimes it's just like, hey, just do a smaller book of this one character, and then another smaller book of this other character, and kind of show, hey, these things are happening in parallel, just in different books. I get why, yeah, you'd want to intertwine it to show, hey, here's how time is affecting all of these different characters and consequences, which I talked about a few weeks ago, all that kind of stuff. I get it. But sometimes, especially if you're a newer author, maybe hold off on the tons of subplots and multiple characters, because, again, the readers will have to keep that memory, that knowledge of each individual subplot, each individual character that you've decided, hey, this character is important enough to give them a name and give them a backstory and give them like their motivation, which, I mean, those are kind of the 3 things that you need anyway. And if we get lost, then suddenly it's like, oh man, I gotta get back into that book. It's like, oh, it's a daunting ordeal because I have to then remember everything that's all happened for all these different characters. And, especially if they're minor characters, maybe you need to cut those characters. Because what it comes down to is each character has to have a purpose that furthers the plot. If the character doesn't have a purpose, other than for maybe like one little piece of exposition, maybe that character could be combined. Maybe that character could be part of the main character, or maybe you could combine 2 characters together. I mean, I just read a book recently where I'm like, hey, okay, so there's this main character and her best friend, and I'm like, okay, so why don't you just combine those 2 into one character? Like, why does it have to be 2 separate characters that I gotta follow and keep track of? It's just, it didn't seem like it made any sense that, okay, I've got to keep track of both of these characters and know what their motivations are when their motivations were pretty similar anyway. So it's like, well, why do we have this extraneous character? So too many subplots essentially means too many characters. And if you kind of lose focus of what your story's about, then suddenly you're going to lose your audience, because then you've put the onus on them as the reader to essentially pay attention for you as the writer. And the writer, it's your job to keep the audience informed, but also engaged. And so if you lose them, maybe it's time to cut some fluff from your story, or make a side story. Write a short story that can be published separately. So what do you think, as readers, as writers? What are the things that annoy you? Are there too many subplots in some books? Too many characters? Let us know in the comments below, and maybe if there's something interesting enough, I'll get to it in a future episode. Thanks for watching this episode of Writer Rant. I'm Benjamin M. Weilert.